The night Lord Cedric Ashbourne walked into the Hartwell ballroom, he wore the last good suit he owned and owed money to men who collected debts with broken fingers. 3 months of desperate maneuvering, forged ledgers, borrowed smiles, and it had all come down to this. One room, one man. The Duke of Ravenshade stood at the far end of the hall like a verdict waiting to be read aloud, and every soul in that ballroom already knew it. They had simply come to watch the sentence carried out. There is a particular cruelty in how English society dresses its executions in candlelight and champagne. Stay until the end. The worst part is not what you think. The Hartwell estate sat 12 miles north of London's grey sprawl, and on a clear October evening, its lantern-lined drive could be mistaken for something genuinely beautiful. Torches spaced at intervals along the iron fence, the great house itself blazing with light from every window, carriages stacked 4 deep along the gravel approach, while footmen moved between them with the careful efficiency of men who understood that their employer's social standing depended on the invisible choreography of arrival. Lord Dashwell Hartwell hosted his autumn gathering with the same compulsive frequency other men attended church, and for largely the same reasons: to be seen, to be counted, and to remind those assembled that his name still meant something in this kingdom. It meant considerably less than it had 10 years ago, but no one said so to his face. Cedric Ashbourne arrived at 8:30, later than fashionable, and later still than strategic. He had timed his entrance with the precision of a man who could no longer afford to be early. Arriving before the room filled meant standing exposed, meant the wrong eyes landing on him before he had the cover of crowd and noise and the general blur of social occasion to move within. He needed the room loud. He needed people distracted. He descended from his hired carriage. He'd sold the family coach in June, told the staff it was being repaired, and handed a coin to the footman that he could not quite spare, because a man who could not spare a coin for a footman was already dead in these circles, just not yet buried. The foyer swallowed him in warmth and the smell of hothouse flowers and too many candles burning against the coming cold. Somewhere deeper in the house, a string quartet was working through something Handel, the notes drifting out across the marble floors with the unhurried confidence of music being played for people who were not particularly listening. Cedric handed his coat to an attendant and caught his reflection in the great gilded mirror beside the staircase. He looked like himself. That was the extraordinary thing. How precisely like himself he still looked. The dark coat was brushed clean, the cravat tied correctly, the silver at his temples giving him the distinguished air that had always served him well with certain women and certain lenders. He had the face of a man who had never been desperate a day in his life. He had been desperate for 11 months. The ballroom opened before him through a pair of doors held by matched footmen, and Cedric walked through into light and sound, and the particular social temperature of 200 aristocrats performing contentment at one another. He recognized most of the faces. Lady Pemberton near the east window, ancient and watchful as a cathedral gargoyle. The Whitmore brothers holding court near the refreshment table, laughing too loudly at something one of them had said. Young Lord Farley in his new military dress, recently returned from the continent with half a reputation, and stories he told at dinner that made the women blush and the older men go very quiet and still. Cedric knew them all, had dined at their tables, ridden their horses, lost money to their fathers at cards, and then, in more recent years, to themselves. He moved into the room with the controlled ease of a man who belonged there. He did not look for the Duke of Ravenshade immediately. That would have been the mistake of a lesser man, or a more honest one. Instead, he collected a glass of champagne from a passing tray, stopped to exchange pleasantries with Sir Edmund Graves about the late summer shooting. Cedric hadn't shot in 2 seasons. The country house that maintained his game lands had been quietly sold in February, and worked his way through the room's social geography with the patience of someone executing a plan rather than fleeing a disaster. The Duke of Ravenshade had arrived before him. Cedric knew this because the room had already organized itself around that fact. There was a quality to a crowded space when Alaric Ravenshade occupied it, a slight reordering of social gravity, clusters of people positioned in relation to where the Duke stood, the way furniture arranges itself around a dominant architectural feature. He was 31 years old and had controlled one of England's 3 largest private fortunes since the age of 24, inheriting a dukedom from a father who had built it through methods the family lawyers preferred not to describe in detail, and that Alaric had expanded through methods that were somewhat more legal but no less ruthless. He was not physically imposing in the way that word usually meant. He was tall enough, broad through the shoulders in the manner of a man who moved through the world with physical confidence. But it was not his body that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. It was the particular quality of his attention. When Alaric Ravenshade looked at you, you understood that he was not performing the act of looking. He was actually seeing. Most people in ballrooms were watching and being watched simultaneously. The social transaction always mutual, always partially performative. The Duke appeared to have no interest in being watched and no awareness that it was happening. He simply looked at whatever he was looking at with the complete, unhurried focus of a man who had never needed to perform anything for anyone. He was standing near the windows with Lord Hartwell and two men Cedric didn't immediately recognize, lawyers or financiers from the quality of their clothing and the particular way they held their glasses, like men who knew the precise cost of the champagne they were drinking and had opinions about whether it was worth it. Hartwell was talking. The Duke was not. His eyes moved through the room at intervals, slow and methodical, the way a man surveys land he either owns or is considering purchasing. They found Cedric. Held for exactly 3 seconds, moved on. Cedric kept his face pleasant and looked away first, because looking away first was the only move available to him, and he had long since learned to take the moves available rather than mourn the ones that weren't. He spent 40 minutes not approaching the Duke. He refreshed his champagne. He spoke to Lady Morville about her daughter's recent engagement. He listened to old Pemberton's account of a property dispute in the north with the careful attention of a man who found property disputes genuinely fascinating. He watched the dance floor where younger members of the assembled company were working through a quadrille with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and he thought about the numbers in the way he had learned not to think about the numbers. The sum owed to Mortimer Cross's operation in Southwark. The separate and more quietly terrifying sum owed to the men who ran the tables in the house on Carver Street, the mortgage arrears on Ashbourne House itself, the servants' wages unpaid since August, the school fees for Evelyn's autumn term that he had deferred twice already, and which the headmistress had written about in a letter whose careful language could not quite conceal its contempt. 8 years old. His daughter was 8 years old, and her school fees were 4 months outstanding, and the headmistress was writing careful letters. He thought about that precisely long enough to feel the specific shame of it, and then he moved the thought to the place where he kept the other thoughts he couldn't afford to inhabit, and he refreshed his champagne again. At 9:10, he crossed the room toward Alaric Ravenshade. Hartwell saw him coming and had the grace, or perhaps the cowardice, to find a reason to draw the two financiers away, leaving the Duke standing alone near the window with his glass and his complete indifference to the social dynamics currently playing out around him. Cedric covered the last 15 feet with a smile he had spent 20 years perfecting, the smile of a man who wanted something but would die before admitting it, and extended his hand. Ravenshade, good to see you out. The Duke looked at the hand, shook it with the brief, precise grip of a man completing a formality. Ashbourne. Fine evening Hartwell's put on, though I suspect half the county came hoping you'd make an appearance. Cedric kept his voice light, conversational, the tone of one peer to another. You've been something of a ghost this season. I've been working. Of course. A pause. I heard about the Meridian acquisition. Impressive move. It was a straightforward transaction. Your straightforward transactions tend to end with the other party wondering what happened to them. Cedric smiled. The Duke did not. I wanted to speak with you tonight, if you have a moment. Privately. There's a matter of some, I know why you're here. The words came without inflection, not unkind, not cruel, simply accurate, delivered with the flat economy of a man who did not see the point in letting people work up to things they were going to say regardless. Cedric kept the smile. It cost him something. Do you? You owe Cross £4,200. You owe the Carver Street operation another $6,800. You're in arrears on the Ashbourne mortgage by 7 months, and you've been managing your visible finances with ledger adjustments that will hold for approximately another 3 weeks before anyone examines them closely enough to notice. The Duke looked at him with those steady, dissecting eyes. I know why you're here. The ballroom continued its noise around them. Someone laughed near the dance floor. The quartet finished Handel and began something more contemporary. Cedric was aware, with a physical acuity that he associated with moments of genuine danger, of the specific social exposure of his position. standing 6 feet from the Duke of Ravenshade in a room full of people who all wanted to know what they were saying, in a conversation that had just made him briefly forget how to breathe. "You've been thorough," Cedric said. "I generally am." "Then you'll understand this is a sensitive situation." "All situations involving this amount of money are sensitive." Cedric glanced around the room, the instinct of a man checking escape routes, and lowered his voice slightly, though the Duke had not bothered to lower his. "I have assets. The Northfield property, the Northfield property has a second mortgage taken out in March. The Ashbourne silver was sold in July through a dealer in Bristol. The paintings in the East Gallery went in August." The Duke took a slow drink of champagne. "What assets did you have in mind?" Somewhere in the chest of Lord Cedric Ashbourne, the last structure holding the performance upright made a sound like a bridge bearing too much weight. "I need time," he said. "You've had time." "More time." "To do what with it?" The Duke's voice was not a question. It was a statement shaped like one, the rhetorical form of a man who had already run the calculations and found the answer unsatisfying. "You've had 4 months since Cross's people first came to my attention. In 4 months, you have not sold any assets of sufficient value. You have not secured alternate financing, and you have not altered the underlying pattern that created this situation." He paused. "What would you do with more time, Ashbourne?" Cedric said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't a lie, and the particular quality of the Duke's attention made lying feel less like a social strategy and more like swinging a punch at a wall. "I have a proposal," Cedric said. "I assumed you did. It requires the terms require a degree of—" He stopped, started again. There was no graceful way to walk through this door. There had never been a graceful way. The pretense of grace was itself a form of cowardice, and Cedric had spent 11 months in cowardice and it had not served him. "I'm prepared to sign over my remaining holdings, everything, the estate, the house in town, whatever remains in the accounts, in exchange for settlement of the debts and financial arrangement going forward, an allowance, something to... That doesn't come to the sum owed, not at current valuations." "No." Cedric held the Duke's gaze. There would be an additional element to the arrangement. A silence of 3 seconds. In the middle distance, Lady Pemberton was watching them with the particular attention of a woman who had been reading ballroom dynamics for 60 years and recognized a significant transaction when she saw one being conducted. "My daughter," Cedric said. "Evelyn. She's 8. She's been at the Hartley School in Bath. She's a good child. She won't cause—" "You're offering your daughter." The words, spoken plainly in that uninflected voice, had a quality that Cedric had not anticipated. He had thought about this moment for 3 weeks, had turned the framing over in his mind at 2 in the morning, when the specific darkness of genuine ruin closes around a man's thoughts. He had found language for it: guardianship, arrangement, a better future for the child than a debtor's father could provide. He had built a version of it that he could say aloud and partially believe. The Duke had taken 6 words and removed all the construction and left the thing itself standing in the middle of Lord Hartwell's ballroom. "A guardianship arrangement," Cedric said. "She needs— I understand what you're proposing. She's provided for, better than I can—" "Cedric." The Duke used his given name for the first time. It was not warm. It was simply a door closing on the scaffolding of justification. "I'll have my solicitor draw the papers. They'll be delivered to your address tonight. Sign them and the debts are settled, and you'll receive a quarterly allowance for the remainder of your life, provided you make no attempt to contact the girl or interfere with her circumstances going forward." The Duke looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "Do you understand what provided means in that sentence?" Cedric's mouth was dry. He had finished his champagne without noticing. "Yes." "Good." The Duke turned back toward the window. The conversation, apparently, was over. Aunt. The papers arrived at 11:30. Cedric sat alone in the small room that Hartwell had made available for guests requiring a private moment. A narrow study off the main corridor, shelves of books that had never been opened, a writing desk, a lamp turned low. The solicitor's man had delivered the envelope with the neutral efficiency of someone delivering a package rather than a document that would alter the course of 2 lives, and had waited, standing, while Cedric read through the terms once, twice, and then a third time because the act of reading felt like doing something, and doing something felt marginally more bearable than sitting still. The terms were as stated, clear, precise. Cedric's legal signature would transfer full custody and guardianship of Eveline Ann Ashbourne, minor, age 8, to Alaric James Ravenshade, Duke of Ravenshade, effective immediately. The debts would be settled within 48 hours. The Ashbourne estate and remaining holdings would transfer through a separate legal instrument to be executed at the Duke's convenience. The quarterly allowance was specified. Adequate, neither generous nor punitive, the financial equivalent of the Duke's uninflected voice. The page that stayed in Cedric's hands longest was the guardianship instrument. He was not, in any version of himself that he could locate in honest memory, a good father. He knew this the way people know things they have spent years choosing not to examine directly. Eveline's mother had died when the girl was 3, and Cedric had responded to grief in the manner of many men of his class and temperament, by ensuring that the grief was handled by other people. There had been nurses, then a governess, then the school in Bath. He had seen his daughter at Christmas and occasionally in summer, and he had found, in those encounters, that she looked at him with eyes that were very like her mother's, and that he did not know what to do with that information, and so he had largely ensured that the encounters were brief. He sent gifts, he paid the fees when he could. He had loved her, in the way that men who don't know how to love anyone love the people they are obligated to, which was a kind of love that served primarily to make the person doing it feel somewhat better, and provided the recipient with very little of practical use. He picked up the pen, set it down, picked it up again. The thing about the bottom of a man's character is that it reveals itself slowly, and then all at once. Cedric had believed in some ambient and unexamined way that he was the kind of man who would not do this. Not because he had evidence for that belief, but because most men believe themselves to be a kind of man they have never actually been tested as. The test was sitting on the writing desk in Lord Hartwell's study at 11:30 on an October evening, and Cedric Ashbourne was discovering the kind of man he was. He signed. The solicitor's man collected the document, inclined his head with the professional neutrality of someone who has witnessed worse, and departed. Cedric sat for a long time in the room with the unread books. Good. The ballroom was still alive with music and conversation when Cedric returned to it, because a gathering of 200 people does not pause for the private disasters of any individual participant, which is simultaneously the cruelest and most merciful quality of such occasions. He needed a drink that was stronger than champagne, and he found it at the refreshment table. Lord Hartwell kept a decent whiskey for those who required it, and he stood at the edge of the room and watched the evening continue around him. He saw the Duke of Ravenshade speaking with Hartwell near the main doors. He saw the footman enter through the servants' passage and cross to where the Duke stood and speak quietly in his ear. He saw the Duke's expression remain precisely as it had been, that settled, uninflected steadiness, as he listened, and nod once, and follow the footman back through the door. Cedric's glass was halfway to his mouth when the sound cut through the ballroom. Not loud, not a scream. A child's crying has a particular quality when it is quiet. When it is the crying of a child who has learned that crying loudly produces no useful result and has therefore reduced itself to the minimum, the sound of someone enduring rather than appealing. It came from the direction of the main staircase, and it made several of the women nearby turn their heads, and made several of the older men suddenly find their glasses extremely interesting. It had not occurred to him, the school. It was past 11. They must have gone directly to the school in Bath, the solicitor's men. They must have... The party near the staircase separated slightly, and Cedric saw his daughter. She was in her nightdress. Someone had put a coat over her shoulders, an adult's coat, far too large, the sleeves covering her hands. And she was sitting on the third step of the grand staircase, with her knees together and her hands in her lap, and her face doing the particular thing that his daughter's face did when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of people, which was a thing she had apparently learned to do, and which he had not known she had learned because he had not been present for the learning of it. Her dark hair was loose. They must have taken her from bed. And there were 2 servants standing near her with the careful distance of people who have been told to bring her here and have not been told what to do next. The ballroom had gone perceptibly quieter. 200 aristocrats and their associated entourages, watching. Eveline looked up from the step where she was sitting and scanned the room with those dark, careful eyes, and found her father. held his gaze. And in the particular quality of that 8-year-old gaze, Cedric found something he had no language for, and did not stay with long enough to name, because naming it would have required staying with it, and staying with it was a thing he could not do. He looked away. He heard her say very quietly, quiet enough that only the people immediately around her could hear, but the ballroom was quiet enough now that it carried, "Papa." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Cedric looked at his whiskey glass. The liquid sat still in it, undisturbed, patient, the color of old wood in lamplight. He heard footsteps on the marble, the confident, unhurried footsteps of a man who moved through spaces as though they had been arranged for his use. He did not look up. He listened to the footsteps cross the room, heard the slight change in their quality as they approached the staircase, heard them stop. A silence of perhaps 5 seconds. Then Duke Alaric Ravenshade's voice, very low, stripped of its boardroom precision and containing something Cedric had not heard in it before and could not quite characterize. Not warmth exactly, but the possibility of warmth, the structural readiness for it. "You're Evelyn." A pause. Then his daughter's voice, careful, the voice she used when she did not know yet whether something was safe. "Yes." "My name is Alaric. You've had a long night." Another pause. "Are you cold?" The ballroom held its breath. "A little," Evelyn said. "There's a fire in the east sitting room. Come." Cedric heard his daughter stand, heard the slight sound of the oversized coat being adjusted, heard footsteps, 2 sets, crossing the marble floor, moving toward the corridor that led away from the ballroom and its assembled witnesses. He did not turn to watch them go. Beside him, someone he didn't register who, breathed out a quiet sound that was not quite speech. Around him the ballroom began to reassemble itself slowly, the way water resettles after a stone has been dropped through it. The music started again somewhere, tentative at first and then with more confidence, as though the musicians had collectively decided that the appropriate response to what they had just witnessed was to pretend they had been playing all along. Cedric stood at the refreshment table with his whiskey, and he thought about nothing very specifically, which was a skill he had developed over 11 months of practice and which served him tolerably well for the first 2 minutes. Then he thought about his daughter's face when she had found him in the room, the expression in it. Not betrayal. He might have managed betrayal. Betrayal implied expectation, implied that he had set a standard which he had then violated, and he could have lived with that. What he saw in her face, in the 3 seconds before she said his name, was something that landed much lower and was much harder to carry: recognition. She had looked at him and she had recognized something she already knew, something that had been true for a long time, something she had worked out quietly in the way that children work things out when the adults around them provide no explanation, and so they construct their own. She had recognized that he was going to leave her with this man. She had known before she said his name, and she had said it anyway. Cedric finished his whiskey, set the glass down on the white tablecloth, straightened his coat with the automatic grooming reflex of a man whose exterior presentation had long since become the only architecture he maintained with any regularity. He walked to the foyer, retrieved his borrowed coat, descended the stone steps to where the hired carriage had been waiting at the rear of the line for 2 hours, the driver hunched against the October cold, the horses restless and steaming gently in the chill air. He climbed in. The carriage moved. Behind him, every window in the Hartwell estate burned gold against the dark. And somewhere inside it, in a room with a fire, a man who frightened the entire English aristocracy was sitting with an 8-year-old girl in an oversized coat, and the expression that had crossed his face when he first saw her standing alone on the staircase, that brief, involuntary fracture in the surface of a man who had spent a decade making sure his surface was uncrackable, was something that Cedric had caught from across the room in the half-second before the Duke had schooled his expression back to stillness. He had seen it. He did not know what it meant. He decided, with the practical efficiency of a man who had learned to manage what he could not afford to know, that it was not his concern anymore. He had signed the papers. The debts would be settled. There was an allowance. A man could rebuild from an allowance, given sufficient time and sufficient nerve, and Cedric Ashbourne had never been short of either. The carriage rolled north through the October dark, and he put his daughter's face away in the place where he kept the things he could not afford to inhabit, and he thought instead about what could be done in a quarter year with a clean financial slate and the right opportunities. He did not think about the expression on the Duke's face. He did not think about it for a very long time. Percent. In the east sitting room of the Hartwell estate, a fire burned low and steady in the grate. Eveline Ashbourne sat in a chair that was too large for her, the borrowed coat folded now across the armrest, and she watched the fire with the particular composure of a child who had been composing herself in front of adults for most of her conscious memory. Her hands were in her lap. Her feet did not reach the floor. The Duke sat in the chair across from her. He had said very little in the past 10 minutes. He had poured her a cup of warm tea from the tray that a servant had brought without being asked. The domestic infrastructure of large houses moved around Alaric Ravenshade the way water moved around an established obstacle, automatically, efficiently. And he had asked her one question about whether she preferred to have the window open or closed. And she had said closed, please, and he had closed it, and they had sat in the warmth together while the distant music of the party pressed faintly through the walls. He was, she had decided, the most frightening person she had ever seen. Not in the way that the men who came to see her father sometimes frightened her. The loud men, the red-faced men, the men with the flat eyes who looked at furniture as they walked through rooms as though pricing it. This man was frightening in a different way. He was frightening the way a cliff edge was frightening. There was nothing actively threatening in it, just a quality of altitude, of gravity made visible, of the simple fact that a great deal of power was present in one place and operating under very precise control. She had seen his face when he came to the staircase. She was 8 years old, but she was not stupid, and she had been reading adult faces for most of her life because adult faces were the primary information source available to her, and she had learned to read them carefully. She had seen the moment when he looked at her, the fraction of a second before his face settled back into its arranged stillness. And what she had seen in that fraction of a second was something she had no name for, but which her body recognized as she recognized warmth and cold, as information that landed below the level of thought. She wasn't sure what to do with that information. She looked at him across the fire. "Are you going to send me somewhere?" she said. The Duke looked at her. "No." "Papa did." "I know. He sends me places when he doesn't know what to do with me." She looked back at the fire. "The school in Bath is nice. Mrs. Hartley is strict, but she's fair. I don't mind it." "You won't be going back to the school in Bath." Something in Eveline's chest moved. Not quite fear, not quite relief. A more complicated thing that didn't have a name in her vocabulary yet. "Where will I go?" "Ravenshade Manor. With me." He paused. "You'll have your own rooms, a proper education, better than Bath." She thought about this for a moment. "Why?" The Duke was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which was fine. Adults frequently didn't answer questions they found inconvenient, and she had learned to extract information from the silence they left in place of answers. But then he said, very quietly, something she had not expected. "Because I had something taken from me once, when I was young, and I know what that makes you into, if no one pays attention." Eveline looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His face was perfectly still. But in the quality of the stillness, in the particular way a person held themselves when they were containing something that wanted to move, she read something that reached past her wariness and touched something much older and more fundamental, the part of every person that recognizes its own history in the history of someone else. She didn't know his name properly yet. She knew it, but she hadn't said it. "Alaric," she said, trying it. He looked at her. Will you be?" She stopped. She was not sure how to ask what she was asking. "Are you unkind?" The Duke of Ravenshade feared across 3 counties and 9 industries, the man who had settled debts and destroyed reputations and built an empire in the ruins of other men's failures, looked at the girl in the chair that was too big for her and said, "Not to you." Outside the east sitting room, the Hartwell party wound its careful way toward midnight. Carriages began to collect their passengers. The string quartet played its last number. The assembled aristocracy of England began its slow dispersal back to houses and estates and comfortable certainties, carrying with them the evening's primary piece of gossip, the Ashbourne deal, the girl on the staircase, the Duke's expression when he crossed the room, which would be circulated and embellished and eventually solidified into one of those social facts that outlast the memory of anyone who was actually present. And somewhere on the North Road, in a hired carriage rattling through the dark, Lord Cedric Ashbourne sat with his eyes closed and his hands flat on his thighs and thought about nothing at all, while in a room with a dying fire, Two people who had both been abandoned by the same machinery of wealth and expectation sat in chairs that faced each other and said nothing further and breathed the same warm air and waited, without knowing they were waiting, for whatever came next. What no one in that ballroom understood, as the candles burned low and the carriages pulled away, was that the transaction they had witnessed was not an ending. It was a clock beginning to run, and the man who had purchased a child's future to settle a desperate man's debts had already made a decision, standing at the foot of that staircase in the 3 seconds before he spoke, that would cost him the next 12 years of carefully maintained solitude and every wall he had spent a decade building. And finally, at the far end of that long road, the last piece of the story none of them had thought to anticipate. But that is the nature of clocks. They run whether or not you're watching. The first year was the hardest, and not for the reasons Evelyn had anticipated. She had anticipated coldness. She had built her expectations on the architecture of everything she already knew about powerful men. Her father's friends, the men who moved through Ashbourne House with their loud certainties, and their tendency to look past her as though she were part of the furniture. And she had prepared herself accordingly, the way a person prepares for weather. Keep your head down. Be useful. Take up as little space as possible. She had been practicing that particular skill for most of her conscious life, and she was, by 8 years old, genuinely accomplished at it. What she had not prepared for was the silence. Not hostile silence. Not the charged, pressurized silence of a man about to say something cutting or a house holding its breath before something broke. Ravenshade Manor operated in a different register entirely. A deep, functional quiet that was less absence than presence. The sound of a place running exactly as it was designed to run, efficiently and without drama. The staff moved through the corridors with the trained invisibility of people who had been selected for competence rather than personality. The rooms were large and kept meticulously and contained in their shelves and surfaces evidence of a mind that organized the world by use rather than display. No portraits of ancestors staring from the walls with expressions designed to intimidate visitors. No decorative excess, just space and light, and the pervasive sense of a man who had built an environment that served him rather than performed for others. Evelyn spent her first 3 weeks at the manor learning where everything was. She did this quietly, systematically, the way she learned most things, by observation rather than inquiry, because inquiry required trusting that the person being asked would answer honestly, and she had learned that this was not always a safe assumption. She mapped the house in her mind. She noted which doors were always open and which were kept closed. She identified the rhythms of the staff. When the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, made her morning rounds, when the kitchens ran their afternoon quiet, when the East Library was empty and available and smelled of paper and the specific kind of solitude that was actually restful rather than lonely. She saw the Duke at meals and occasionally in the corridors, and once in the East Library when she came to return a book and found him already there, seated at the large desk near the window, with papers arranged in front of him in a pattern she didn't understand but recognized as having its own logic. He had looked up when she entered. She had stopped in the doorway with the book against her chest, prepared to retreat. He had said, "You can come in. There's room." So she had come in. She had shelved her book and taken another from the shelf 2 rows down and sat in the chair by the second window, and they had occupied the same room in parallel silence for an hour and a half. And when she left, she had felt, for the first time since the night at the Hartwell estate, something that was not quite safe but was in the same general direction. The tutor arrived in November. His name was Mr. Aldous Graves, no relation to Sir Edmund, he clarified immediately, with the tone of a man who had been making that clarification for years. And he was a former lecturer at Oxford who had left the university under circumstances he declined to specify, and who taught with the rigorous, unsentimental thoroughness of someone who genuinely believed that a young mind not given sufficient challenge would find its own, less constructive challenges. He was the best educator Evelyn had ever encountered, which was not a comparison she could make in full until several years later when she had more to compare him to, but which she recognized immediately in the simple quality of his attention. He listened to what she said. He pushed back when she was imprecise. He did not treat her questions as interruptions. When she asked him, 3 weeks in, who had hired him and what she was supposed to be learning, he had said, without looking up from the text he was annotating, "The Duke hired me. You're supposed to be learning everything." "Everything is a large category." "Yes," he said. That's the point. She had thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Alaric watched her from a sufficient distance that she could not feel it as surveillance. This was a discipline, and like all disciplines, it required maintenance. His instinct, the instinct he had built and refined and made into the primary operational tool of a decade of business and social maneuvering, was toward comprehensive information. He liked to know things. He liked to know them thoroughly and early, before the people those things concerned were aware of being known. It was the instinct that had allowed him to arrive at the Hartwell gathering with a precise accounting of Cedric Ashbourne's financial position and a completed mental model of the likely terms of whatever deal the man was going to propose. It was the instinct that had built Ravenshade Holdings from an inherited mess of undermanaged assets into a controlled empire. It was also, he recognized, an instinct that had to be managed carefully around an 8-year-old girl who had already had every important decision in her life made without her input. So he watched at distance. He noted the systematic way she moved through the house, cataloging rather than exploring. The difference was meaningful. It said something about how much of her caution was structural rather than situational. He noted that she read in the same posture his mother had read, spine very straight, book held slightly too high, the holdover of some early instruction about proper deportment that had calcified into habit. He noted that she was careful with things, careful with the library books, careful with the china at meals, careful with the furniture she sat on, the special carefulness of someone who has lived in proximity to the anxiety of lost or broken objects. He noted that she was not, as a default, unhappy. She was watchful. There was a significant difference. He had met with Graves after the first month. The tutor had delivered a characteristically sparse assessment. The girl was exceptionally quick. Her mathematical reasoning was already ahead of most students twice her age. Her reading comprehension was extensive, but her writing was suppressed. She wrote carefully, never experimentally, never beyond what she was certain of, which was the literary signature of a mind that had been taught, explicitly or implicitly, that exceeding expectations created problems. "What does she need?" Alaric had said. Graves had considered this with the deliberate weight of a man who didn't believe in quick answers. Time, consistency, and someone to be wrong in front of without it costing her anything. Alaric had looked at him. "She doesn't make mistakes," Graves said. "Or rather, she makes them internally and corrects before they're visible. That takes an enormous amount of energy that should be going somewhere else." He paused. "She needs to discover that mistakes here don't get you sent away." Alaric had said nothing, but after that conversation he had started losing at chess. Not conspicuously. He was not a man given to conspicuous gestures of any kind. They were manipulative in a way he found inefficient, the crude lever when a precise instrument was available. He simply stopped winning as quickly as he could have won, and let the games run longer, and let her find the moves that worked, and did not soften his expression when she did, because softening his expression would have told her she was performing for him rather than playing for herself. She caught him, 4 months in. They were at the chess table in the south sitting room on a Tuesday evening in February. Graves had recommended evening chess as mathematics disguised as leisure, which was exactly the kind of transparent practical efficiency that Alaric respected in the man. And Evelyn had made a move that was not the optimal move, that was in fact a deliberate overextension, and then she had sat back and watched him. He had looked at the board. "You made that worse on purpose," she said. He looked up. Her expression was careful but direct, the expression of someone who has made a calculation and decided the risk of the direct statement is lower than the cost of leaving the thing unspoken. 9 years old, he thought. 9 years old, and she's reading the room like a lawyer. "Did I?" he said. "You've been doing it for weeks. You play differently when you're working." She glanced at the board and back to him. "You look at it differently. When you're actually trying, you go still. When you're not, your hand moves to the piece before you've finished thinking." Alaric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do about that?" She thought about this with the same deliberate weight Graves applied to questions he respected. "Play properly," she said. "I'd rather lose to the real game than win to the one you're managing." He looked at her. She met his gaze and did not look away. And in the specific quality of that refusal to look away, not defiance, not performance, just the steady willingness to occupy a difficult moment without flinching, he felt something move in his chest that he did not examine directly because he had not yet developed the vocabulary for it, and developing vocabulary for things required acknowledging them, and he was not ready for that particular acknowledgement. "All right," he said. He played properly. She lost in 11 moves. She smiled at the board with a sharp, genuine satisfaction that had nothing to do with the outcome and everything to do with the quality of the contest, and said, again, Tristram. The years moved, not quickly. Alaric had no patience for the literary convention that compressed time into a single breath. But with the steady accumulation that real time had, each season differentiated from the one before by small increments of change that were only visible as change in retrospect. Evelyn grew. Not just in height, though she did that efficiently, approaching her 14th year with the slightly awkward grace of someone whose body was reorganizing itself faster than her sense of spatial self could accommodate. She grew in the way that mattered more to him to observe and more difficult to describe. Her mind opened outward, the careful suppression loosening incrementally as she accumulated evidence that this house and this life were not structured around the concealed threat she had been braced against. She started making mistakes in front of Graves and arguing with him about his corrections. She started leaving books in wrong places on the shelf, not from carelessness, but from the specific disorganization of a mind too engaged with ideas to track objects. She started talking at dinner, not the careful, minimal talking of someone managing their social exposure, but actual talking, with opinions in it, with the occasional flash of a wit that was dry and quick and targeted, that had clearly been present for years and only now felt sufficiently safe to deploy. He watched that too. He watched it from across dinner tables and across the south sitting room and across the east library where they still occasionally occupied the same silence in parallel, though the silence had changed quality over the years, less the careful mutual assessment of two unfamiliar people, and more the comfortable ambient quiet of two people who had been in each other's company long enough that the silence required no management. He did not think about what that quality change meant. He was very disciplined about that. Band. The first time someone said something to him about it directly was in the spring of Evelyn's 15th year, and it was Lord Harmon Whitmore who said it, which was unfortunate because Harmon Whitmore was both a significant business associate and a fundamentally unsubtle man, which made the conversation difficult to deflect without consequence. They were at Whitmore's townhouse for a dinner that was functionally a negotiation, a railway consortium that Alaric was restructuring and that Whitmore had capital invested in. And after the meal, when the other guests had been drawn into card games in the adjoining room, Whitmore had poured 2 glasses of brandy with the deliberate manner of a man who had been building towards something and had finally located the right moment. "I'm going to say something," Whitmore said, "and I want you to hear it as someone who has done business with you for 8 years and has no interest in your personal life beyond its potential to complicate mine." "Say it," Alaric said. "The Ashbourne girl." Whitmore set 1 glass in front of him. "The things people are saying, you understand that they're saying them. I'm aware of what people say. Not just the gossip crowd. I mean people with actual standing. Pemberton, the Alderton family, Moreville." Whitmore held his glass without drinking it. "She's 15 and she's been in your house for 7 years, and the word they're using is not guardianship." Alaric looked at him. Whitmore, to his credit, held the look. "I'm telling you because it's going to become a problem for the railway negotiation if it becomes loud enough, and because—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Because there is a version of this situation that I think you would not want to be true about yourself, and that I think you'd want to know is being articulated." The air in the room changed temperature. Alaric set his glass down with a precision that was itself a communication. "Say what you're actually saying, Harmond." "I'm saying that a man who has not introduced that girl to society, who has not made arrangements for her future, who keeps her in his house and educates her and appears to have no intention of presenting her to the world, that man, in the eyes of this particular world, looks like a man who is not interested in anyone else having access to her." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "And what do you think?" Alaric said. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then, with the honesty of a man who had decided that half measures were more dangerous than the whole, "I think you're one of the most controlled people I've ever known. I think you've been controlled about this situation with a degree of precision that itself tells me something. I think whatever this is, you have rules about it that you enforce on yourself." He paused. "I also think that rules a man needs that badly are usually guarding something that makes the rules necessary." Alaric picked up his glass, drank, set it down. "The railway consortium," he said. I want to discuss the Eastern Corridor extension. Whitmore looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Then he nodded and picked up his own glass and let the subject close. But it didn't close for Alaric. It traveled back to Ravenshade Manor with him in the carriage through the May night, sitting in the dark across from nothing, his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes on the passing window dark of the countryside. It sat in his chest with the specific density of a thing that had been named and could not be unnamed. Whitmore was not a subtle man. The unsubtle articulation of an unsubtle man did not, in general, constitute reliable intelligence about one's own interior condition. And yet, the rules he had built, the precise distances, the managed quality of his attention, the careful architecture of a guardianship that looked and functioned like guardianship in every externally visible dimension, those rules had a shape, and the shape of a rule was the shape of what it was guarding against. He knew what they were guarding against. He had known for some time. He simply had not allowed himself the particular clarity of the direct statement, which was a discipline he could maintain indefinitely until a man like Harmond Whitmore sat across from him with brandy and 8 years of professional goodwill and said the shape aloud. He arrived back at Ravenshade Manor at midnight. The house was dark except for the East Library, where a lamp still burned in the window. He stood in the drive for a moment and looked at the light. Then he went inside and went to his study and closed the door and sat in the dark for a long time and made himself think the thought he had been not thinking for 3 years, with the same ruthless clarity he applied to everything else that mattered, because the only thing worse than knowing a thing was being the man who refused to know it while it shaped every decision he made. He thought it. He sat with it. He put it away. And when he came to breakfast the following morning and Evelyn looked up from the book she was reading at the table, a bad habit Graves had long since given up correcting, and said without looking up, "You came back late. Was the Whitmore dinner productive?" he said, adequately, and poured his coffee and sat down across from her and read his correspondence, and everything was exactly as it had been for 7 years. Except that it wasn't. It was the same in every visible particular, and entirely different in the one particular that was invisible, and that was the particular that sat in Alaric Ravenshade's chest like a clock that had been running for years and had only just now been heard. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October. It came without announcement, which was itself information. Legitimate correspondence to Ravenshade Manor arrived through established channels, and Alaric had not established a channel for the name written in the upper left corner of the envelope. He recognized the handwriting before he read it. He would have recognized it from across a room. He had seen it on school fee notices and on the social correspondence that occasionally arrived redirected to the manor from addresses Cedric Ashbourne had occupied and abandoned over the years. Each letter a small data point in the ongoing story of a man's sustained decline. He opened it. He read it once. He set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment with the still, absolute focus of a man confronting something he has been expecting and is still not fully prepared for. Cedric Ashbourne was coming back to London. He had heard about Evelyn, he wrote, about how she had grown, about the education, the social position, the fortune that would come to her through the arrangements of the past 7 years. He wrote about his health, which had been poor. He wrote about changed circumstances, which was the language of a man who had been through money and come out the other side. He wrote about his daughter in the particular way that men who have abandoned their rights to a thing write about it, with the possessive language of ownership and the emotional language of loss, and no apparent awareness that these two registers were in direct conflict. He wrote that he would very much like to see her, that he believed she would want to see him, that a father's claim was, after all, a father's claim. Alaric read the letter a second time. Then he folded it, placed it in the lower right drawer of the desk, locked the drawer, and sat back in his chair. Evelyn was in the East Library at that moment, working through the Latin text that Graves had assigned her for the week, her dark hair pinned up in the slightly imprecise way she had of managing it when she was focused on something else. The window light falling across the desk in the particular afternoon quality he had been watching shift through the seasons of her growing up in this house. 7 years. He had spent 7 years building something that Cedric Ashbourne had not earned and did not deserve, and was now, in the language of a letter that reeked of desperation dressed as sentiment, reaching toward. The clock in his chest, the one he had only recently allowed himself to hear, struck a note that was different from any note it had struck before. Not love, exactly, or not only love, not the clean, declarable thing the word implied. Something older and more structural than that. The thing that lives beneath love and holds it up. The thing that does not negotiate. He looked at the locked drawer. Then he looked at the window. The East Library window was visible from this angle. He could see the lamp burning, the slight motion of a shadow that was her, working, unaware, still believing that the world she had built inside these walls was stable, was hers, was not about to be put under pressure by a man who had signed away his claim to her over a gambling debt and spent 7 years spending the allowance. He had a choice to make, not about whether to protect her. That was not a choice. That had not been a choice since the night he crossed a ballroom and saw a child sitting alone on a staircase with the knowledge already in her eyes. That part had never required deciding. The choice was about how. And the how was going to require him to stop managing the distance, to stop being careful, to let the thing he had been containing with 7 years of discipline come forward into the open, where it could be used. He opened the drawer, took out the letter, read it one more time. The clock ran. He did not tell Eveline about the letter. This was the first decision, and it was made in the span of a breath, sitting at his desk with Cedric Ashbourne's handwriting flattened under his palm. She was 16 now. Not 15, he had miscounted in the dark arithmetic of his own unsettled thoughts. And she was not a child who needed information managed on her behalf. She had not been that child for several years. She was precise and observant, and she read the quality of silences the way other people read text. And she would know, if he told her, exactly what the letter represented. That was precisely why he didn't tell her. Not to protect her from the knowledge, to protect her from having to carry it before he had dealt with it. He wrote back to Cedric Ashbourne the following morning. 3 sentences. The tone of a man who had already decided the shape of the conversation and was merely notifying the other party of its terms. He would receive Cedric at Ravenshade Manor in 2 weeks. The meeting would concern the legal arrangements established 7 years prior and nothing beyond them. Any attempt to contact Eveline directly, through any channel, prior to that meeting would be treated as a breach of the original contract and responded to accordingly. He sent it by private courier. Then he went to find Graves. The tutor was in the East Library, as he generally was at 9 in the morning, which was itself one of the things Alaric had come to rely on about the man. The predictable precision of his habits, the sense that Graves operated in the world with a clockwork consistency that was less rigidity than a kind of principled respect for his own time. He was marking a stack of Eveline's written work when Alaric came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting a visit and had opinions prepared. "She told you," Alaric said. "She asks questions," Graves said. "It's her primary intellectual characteristic. One of them was about contract law. Specifically about the conditions under which a guardianship agreement established for a minor remains binding once that minor approaches the age of majority." He set down his pen. "She's 16, Ravenshade. She knows what that means. She doesn't know about the letter. She doesn't need the letter. She's been doing the mathematics since she was 12. Graves looked at him with the flat directness of a man who had spent 15 years in academic institutions watching powerful people avoid truths that inconvenience them. "She knows her father is alive. She knows he took an allowance. She knows the terms of the arrangement become negotiable at 18. He paused. "What she doesn't know is what you intend." The word landed in the room with a weight that Alaric recognized as deliberate. "What I intend," he said, "is to handle Ashbourne." "That's a tactical answer." "It's the answer I have." Graves was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen, set it back down. "She asked me last week whether a person could be obligated to someone who had never obligated them, whether debt could run in a direction that was never agreed to." He looked at the window. "I told her that was a philosophical question rather than a legal one. She said she knew the difference." He paused. "She was asking about you." Alaric looked at him. "She's trying to work out," Graves said carefully, "whether you'll want her to leave when she's 18. Whether the arrangement that brought her here becomes the arrangement that ends her being here. Whether she has built a life in a house that was only ever a temporary structure." He met Alaric's gaze. "She won't ask you. She'll eat herself alive with the question before she asks you directly, because asking directly requires risking the answer." The room was very quiet. "Tell me what to do about that," Alaric said, and it came out differently than he intended. Less the question of a man seeking tactical advice, and more the question of a man who had spent 7 years being certain about everything except this, and had finally run out of the particular energy that certainty required. Graves looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a tutor," he said. "Not a confessor." He picked up his pen and returned to marking. Judge. Cedric Ashbourne arrived on a Tuesday, 14 days after the courier had delivered the reply, and he arrived in a hired carriage that Alaric's staff had noted and reported, and he arrived with a solicitor's man whose name turned out to be Prentice, and whose presence told Alaric immediately that this visit had a prepared legal dimension that Cedric had chosen not to announce. He had aged badly. This was the first thing Alaric registered when Cedric was shown into the south receiving room, a room chosen deliberately for its formal arrangement and its distance from any part of the house Evelyn regularly occupied. 7 years of a quarterly allowance and the absence of consequence had not apparently produced the reformed character that comfortable circumstance sometimes generated in men of weak construction. Cedric was thinner than he'd been at the Hartwell gathering, but not in the lean way, in the way of a man whose body had been processing stress and poor decisions for an extended period, the skin slightly too close to the bone beneath. The eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who had been running a calculation that didn't balance and had been running it for a long time. He was also, Alaric noted, carrying himself with a confidence that was slightly too assembled. The walk of a man who had prepared his posture before entering, who had decided in the carriage how he was going to inhabit this room. Raven shade. Cedric extended his hand. Alaric did not take it. A beat of silence. Cedric withdrew the hand with the smoothness of a man who had been rebuffed by more important people than this, and had developed a technique for absorbing it. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited, which was itself information. "You brought a solicitor," Alaric said. "Prentice assists with my affairs. He's here in an advisory capacity." "He can wait outside." Cedric glanced at the solicitor's man, who had positioned himself near the door with the careful blankness of someone paid to be invisible when required. "I'd prefer he stayed." "I'm certain you would." Alaric looked at him steadily. "He can wait outside." Another beat. Prentice left the room. The door closed. Cedric leaned back slightly in the chair and crossed one leg over the other, the body language of a man performing comfort he didn't feel. "You've done well by her. The reports I've received—" "What reports?" A fractional pause. "I have an interest in my daughter's well-being. It's natural that I would—" "What reports, Cedric?" The use of the given name, the same flat closing it had represented 7 years ago in a different room, worked the same way it had then. Cedric's assembled posture tightened slightly. "I've spoken with people who know the family, who are acquainted with the manor. I understand she's had an excellent education, that she's grown into a remarkable young woman." He paused. "That she'll be of age in 2 years." There it was. Alaric said nothing. "I want to see her," Cedric said. "No. She's my daughter." "You signed a document." "That document governed her minority. She's approaching adulthood. The legal standing of that arrangement has not changed." Alaric's voice was even. The evenness was doing a great deal of work. The terms were not limited by age. They were transfer of custody and guardianship with no specified endpoint. Your solicitor read the same document mine drafted. Prentice has reviewed it extensively. Cedric uncrossed his legs, leaned forward slightly, shifting from performance to something more direct, which was, Alaric thought, actually the more dangerous version of the man. There are aspects of that original arrangement that Prentice believes could be challenged. The circumstances under which it was signed, the financial duress. "You came to that gathering," Alaric said. "You proposed the terms. You signed within the hour." He held Cedric's gaze. "Duress requires a showing that the signing party was coerced. What coercion did I apply?" Cedric was quiet. "What coercion?" Alaric said again, without inflection. "There are other aspects," Cedric said. "The nature of the arrangement as it has developed. The relationship between a grown man and a girl he has housed since childhood." The words came out carefully, practiced, and they were designed to land in a specific place, and they did. "Society has opinions. The Crown has interests in the welfare of young women in ambiguous domestic situations. A formal inquiry—" "Stop." The word came out at a register Alaric rarely used. Not loud. The opposite of loud. Compressed, the way pressure compressed, the way the air changes quality before something structural gives way. Cedric stopped. "You're threatening," Alaric said, "to use the welfare of your daughter. A welfare you abandoned. as a legal instrument to extract money from the person who secured it. He let that sit in the room for a moment. That is what is happening in this conversation. Cedric said nothing. How much? Alaric said. A slight relaxation in Cedric's shoulders, the almost invisible tell of a man who has reached the part of the conversation he came for. The quarterly arrangement has been adequate, but my circumstances have changed. There are debts. There are always debts that require resolution. And there is the matter of Evelyn's future, her inheritance prospects. If she were to marry, if certain arrangements were to be made, she is 16 years old. In 2 years she won't be, and the fortune she stands to access through whatever arrangement you've made for her. Cedric paused. I'm her father. I have standing in that conversation. Any serious suitor would want the family's position understood. The clock in Alaric's chest, the one he had heard since the night of the Whitmore dinner, struck something cold. You came here, he said slowly, to position yourself as a necessary party to her marriage negotiations. Cedric said nothing, which was the same as yes. Get out of my house, Alaric said. Ravenshade, get out. Still even, still compressed. Prentice can drive you back to whatever address you're currently occupying, and you can instruct him to prepare whatever legal challenge you believe you have. And I will respond to it through my own solicitors with the fullness of what I know about your financial history, your gambling operations, and the specific events of the night of October 14th, 7 years ago, including the names of every person present who can testify to the conditions under which that document was signed. He stood. Or you can leave this room today and the quarterly allowance continues, and we do not have this conversation again. Cedric stood as well. The assembled posture was gone. What was underneath it was less polished, older, more corroded, the face of a man who had spent 7 years softening his own culpability in the telling of a story, and who did not respond well to having the actual story stated plainly in a room with good light. She'll want to know me, Cedric said. Whatever you've built here, whatever you've made her into, she'll want to know her father eventually. That's not a legal argument. That's just true. Alaric looked at him. And when she does, Cedric said, it would be better for everyone if that happened with my cooperation, rather than without it. He left. The door closed. Alaric stood in the south receiving room with his hands flat on the desk and the specific silence of a space recently vacated by something that had left a residue. He stayed with it for 30 seconds, which was 30 seconds longer than he generally permitted himself for reactions he hadn't decided on yet. Then he straightened and went to the door and went to find his head of household and gave several quiet instructions about the monitoring of the manor's grounds and approaches. Then he went back to work. He did not go to find Evelyn. He should have. That was the mistake. And he would understand it as a mistake 3 weeks later, when the thing he had not foreseen arrived from the direction he had not been watching. Her name was Mrs. Hargreave. She had been housekeeper at Ravenshade Manor for 11 years, which predated Evelyn's arrival by 4, and she was 63 years old and had the organized, efficient warmth of a woman who had managed large houses for the entirety of her professional life, and who had a genuine and uncomplicated fondness for the girl she had watched grow up in these rooms. Alaric had trusted her completely. That was the thing about complete trust. It didn't announce its limits in advance. He found out on a Wednesday morning in November when the morning correspondence included a note from Cedric Ashbourne, not to him, to Evelyn, care of a post office address in the village, that had been intercepted by his courier system, not because he had ordered Evelyn's correspondence monitored, but because his courier recognized the handwriting on the outer envelope from the previous delivery and had flagged it. He read the note. Then he went to Mrs. Hargreave's sitting room off the kitchen corridor. She was there. She looked at his face when he came in, and she set down the inventory ledger she was holding, and she said quietly, I was going to tell you. When? When I understood what he intended, I thought... She stopped. She asked me about him 2 months ago before he came here. She found a reference in an old household ledger to the quarterly arrangement, and she asked me what it was, and I told her it was a financial arrangement with her father, and she... A pause. She cried. Not much. She turned away, and she was composed again very quickly, but I saw it, and she asked me if there was any way to send him a letter, without going through you. Alaric looked at her. She loves you, Mrs. Hargreave said, and the plainness of it, no preamble, no softening, hit differently than anything Cedric had said in the south receiving room. She loves this house, and she loves the life she has here, and she is terrified, Mr. Ravenshade, completely terrified, that she is going to turn 18 and lose all of it. And I think she thought that if she could speak to her father, she could understand what she came from, and whether she was wanted anywhere that wasn't— She stopped. Wasn't contingent, Alaric said. Mrs. Hargreave was quiet. How many letters? 3. He wrote back to the second one. What did he say? A pause. That he missed her, that he had been unwell, that he thought of her often. She looked at the window. He also asked her in the third letter, his reply to hers, whether she knew the extent of the fortune she would have access to at 18, framed as a father's concern for her understanding of her own circumstances. The cold thing in Alaric's chest moved. She didn't answer that one, Mrs. Hargreave said. She brought it to me and she asked me what I thought it meant, and that was when I understood what he was doing. She met his eyes. I told her I needed to think about it. That was 4 days ago. Alaric stood in the doorway of the housekeeper's sitting room and felt the particular quality of a structure he had believed solid demonstrating its fault lines. Not in Mrs. Hargreave. She had made a mistake born of genuine affection for a girl, which was a human error and not a betrayal in any structural sense. The fault line was in his own architecture. He had built the house around protecting Evelyn from Cedric Ashbourne, and in doing so, he had not considered that she might, at 16, go looking for the thing she had never had, because the thing she had never had was the simplest thing. A parent who wanted her, unconditioned and without calculation, and no amount of education or chess or a fire in a sitting room on a cold night could fully substitute for the absence of that specific thing. He had been so certain about the external threat. He had not thought carefully enough about the interior need it was exploiting. Where is she? He said. East Library. She's been there since breakfast. He went. She was at the desk by the window with a book open that she was not reading. He knew she was not reading it because she had not moved the page in the 60 seconds he had been standing in the doorway, and Eveline did not read slowly. She looked up. She saw his face. She closed the book. You know, she said. Not a question. Yes. A silence of 3 seconds. She looked at the closed book, then back at him. When she spoke, her voice was controlled in the way he had watched her learn to control it. The careful steadiness of someone who had decided that the inside of this conversation was not going to be visible on the outside of her face. I should have told you. Yes, he said again. I thought— She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. I thought if you knew I'd written to him, you'd think that I wanted to go back. That I was ungrateful for— Evelyn. She stopped. Look at me, he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She had moved past the point where this was going to produce tears, which meant she had been sitting with it for days and had done whatever she needed to do with that part of it privately, alone, which was exactly what he had feared and exactly what Graves had described, and exactly what his 7 years of careful management had, despite everything, still not prevented. He's using you, Alaric said, plainly, without architecture. Not because he wants to know you, because you are 18 in 2 years, and there is money attached to that fact, and he wants access to the conversation about it. Her face did not change. You already knew that, he said. I thought— She looked at the window. I thought maybe both things could be true, that he could want the money, and also— She stopped. A muscle moved in her jaw. People can want 2 things at the same time, even bad ones. Yes, Alaric said. They can. She was quiet for a moment. Is that what you think happened with you, with the original arrangement? She looked back at him. That you wanted the asset transfer, and also— She didn't finish the sentence. He looked at her across the East Library with the afternoon light falling between them and the question open in the air, and the clock he had been listening to for a year struck something it had never struck before. Not cold, not compressed, not the managed note of a man maintaining distance, and he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has run out of architecture to hide behind, that this was the moment Whitmore had been pointing at. This was the thing the rules had been guarding. Not a feeling, a fact he had been managing for years, and that the 16-year-old across the room from him had just named in a half sentence with the precision of someone who had been waiting to name it and had finally found the moment where the cost of leaving it unspoken was higher than the cost of saying it. He opened his mouth. The door to the East Library opened. Prentice, Cedric's solicitor's man, stood in the doorway with two men Alaric did not recognize and a document whose official seal he recognized immediately. The Crown's Court of Equity, which handled disputes of guardianship and inheritance and the welfare of young persons approaching majority. Behind Prentice, pale and dressed for travel, stood Cedric Ashbourne. Prentice said, "Your Grace, I have here a petition to the Court of Equity requesting a formal review of the guardianship arrangement as it pertains to Miss Eveline Ashbourne, age 16, on grounds of—" "Get out of my library," Alaric said. "On grounds of undue influence, inappropriate domestic arrangement, and the suppression of the ward's right to contact with her natural parent, supported by evidence including—" "Alaric," Eveline's voice, very quiet. He looked at her. Her face had gone the color of chalk. She was looking at her father in the doorway, and the expression on her face was the one he had been watching her build defenses against for 7 years. The expression of someone confronting a wound they had told themselves was healed and discovering, in one unguarded moment, that the scar tissue was not the same thing as recovery. Including correspondence between Miss Ashbourne and her father that demonstrates her expressed desire for contact, which was withheld from the guardian in an act of— Cedric stepped into the room. He looked at his daughter. He said, "Evie," with a softness in his voice that was the most dangerous thing Alaric had heard in this entire sequence of dangerous things, because it was not entirely performed. There was something real in it, some genuine fragment of the feeling it was shaped like, and that fragment was exactly what made the rest of it so destructive, because it gave Eveline something to believe in, even as the machinery around it was designed entirely to exploit her. The two men with Prentice moved to positions near the door. Alaric stood in the East Library and looked at the document in Prentice's hand, and at Cedric's face, and at Eveline's face, and at the specific geometry of the room, and he understood that Cedric had not come 14 days ago to negotiate. He had come to assess, to confirm what Mrs. Hargreave had already given him, that Eveline had been writing, that she was uncertain about her future, that she was reachable. And he had spent 3 weeks filing the petition and assembling the evidence and arriving today with the court document and the solicitor and the two men at the door so that Alaric would be standing in his own library, unable to move, without the action itself becoming evidence of the undue influence the petition alleged. The trap was not in the document. The trap was in the room. And Alaric Ravenshade, who had spent a decade being the man who set traps rather than walked into them, was standing in the center of one. And the only thing standing between Eveline and what came next was the quality of the decision he made in the next 30 seconds. He looked at her. She was looking back at him. And in her eyes, in the steady, dark, exhausted clarity of them, he read the same thing he had read on a staircase 7 years ago. Not betrayal, not appeal, recognition. She knew what her father was doing. She was asking, without words, what he was going to do about it. The clock in his chest ran. He moved first, not toward Cedric, not toward Prentice with his court document and his careful legal positioning. Alaric crossed the East Library in 4 strides and stopped directly in front of Eveline, putting his body between her and the door, and he said very quietly, so that only she could hear it, "You don't have to say anything to him." She looked up at him. Her face was still chalk pale, but her eyes were steady. The steadiness of someone who had been frightened and had located, beneath the fright, something harder. "I know," she said. "Whatever he says in this room—" "I know," she said again, firmer. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he turned around. Cedric was watching the exchange with an expression that had shifted from performed softness to something more calculating. The face of a man reassessing the room's dynamics and finding them less favorable than anticipated. Prentice stood with the document held at a precise angle, the practiced posture of someone who had been in enough contested rooms to know that the physical presentation of legal authority was itself a form of argument. The two men near the door had not moved, but their attention had sharpened. Alaric looked at Prentice. "Read the document." Prentice blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Read it. Aloud. All of it." He walked to his desk and sat down. The deliberate quality of the movement, unhurried, completely controlled, was itself a recalibration of the room. He was no longer a man caught standing. He was a man who had decided to sit at his own desk in his own library and hear what had been brought to him. If you filed with the Court of Equity, the document is a matter of record. Read it. A pause. Prentice looked at Cedric. Cedric gave a slight nod. Prentice read. It took 11 minutes. The petition was thorough. Alaric could see Cedric's hand in the specific selection of language, the careful framing that stopped just short of direct accusation while establishing the architecture of implication. Undue influence over a minor ward, suppression of natural familial contact, financial arrangements that stood to benefit the guardian at the expense of the ward's independent interests upon majority. The correspondence between Evelyn and her father cited as evidence of the ward's desire for paternal relationship, characterized as having been actively discouraged by the guardian's conduct. None of it was false in its individual components. That was the quality of a well-constructed legal trap. It was built from true things arranged in a configuration that produced a false picture. When Prentice finished, the room was quiet. Evelyn had not moved from the chair where she'd been sitting when Alaric crossed the library. She sat with her hands flat on the closed book and her back straight and her eyes on a point above Prentice's head, the deliberate non-engagement of someone who had decided that her face was not available for anyone in this room to read. Alaric looked at Cedric. "You paid someone in my household," he said. Cedric said nothing. "You needed the correspondence, the letters she sent, the letter you wrote back. Mrs. Hargreave had them. She gave them to you." He paused. "Or she gave them to someone who gave them to you. Either way, you had contact inside this house before you walked into this room with that document. The letters demonstrate—" "I know what they demonstrate." Alaric's voice had dropped to the register it found when the performance of control was no longer necessary because the actual control had taken over. "They demonstrate that a 16-year-old girl wrote to her father because she wanted to know him, and her father responded by asking about her inheritance." He held Cedric's gaze. "Your own letter, your handwriting, the question about the fortune she stands to access at 18. You put that in writing." Something moved through Cedric's expression. A fractional tightening, the tell of a man who has just been reminded of a specific error. "The petition is filed," Prentice said carefully. "Whatever the content of private correspondence, the legal standing of the petition, what do you want?" Alaric said it to Cedric, past Prentice. Direct. No architecture. Cedric looked at him. Then, with the particular honesty of a man who has run out of the energy required to maintain his framing, £20,000, a single settlement, and my name associated publicly with hers going forward, as her father, in whatever social context arises. That's all. "That's all," Alaric repeated. "It's reasonable, given what you gave up." Alaric stood. "Given the document you signed in a house in Hertfordshire, because the alternative was having your debts called in by men who break fingers." He came around the desk. "You want £20,000 and social access to a young woman whose life you sold and whose letters you used to build a legal case against the man who raised her." He stopped. "And you're calling that reasonable?" "I'm calling it a settlement." Cedric's voice had found an edge. "The alternative is a formal inquiry, an inquiry that examines everything. The original arrangement, the terms of the guardianship, the nature of the relationship between a man and a girl he acquired through a gambling debt." "Papa!" Evelyn's voice. The room stopped. She had not moved from the chair. She was still sitting with her hands on the book, but she had turned her head and she was looking directly at her father, and the quality of her gaze was something that had not been in the room before she spoke. Not a child's gaze, not the careful watchfulness of a girl managing her exposure. Something older. Something that had been present for a long time and had finally decided the cost of keeping it contained was higher than the cost of showing it. "You asked me in the third letter if I knew what I would have when I turned 18, she said. Her voice was even. "I didn't answer because I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say without being—" She paused. "Without sounding like I already knew what you were doing." Cedric's face shifted. "Evie, did you miss me?" The question was simple. The simplicity of it was a kind of weapon. It cut under all the legal language and the positioning and the £20,000 and left the bare fact of the thing sitting in the middle of the room where everyone had to look at it. "Of course I— Don't." Her voice was still even. "Don't say of course. I want to know if you actually did. If you thought about me in the 7 years you were gone. If any part of writing those letters was because you wanted to know who I became." She looked at him. Because if any part of it was real, I'd rather know that than win whatever this is. And if none of it was real, she stopped, looked at her hands, then back at him. Then I need to know that too. The silence lasted a long time. Cedric looked at his daughter across the East Library of Ravenshade Manor in the afternoon light, with the court document in his solicitor's hands and £20,000 sitting in the air between them, and his face did something complicated. Something that moved through several expressions too quickly to read cleanly, something that might have been genuine if it hadn't arrived so late and in such company. I thought about you, he said, quietly. I did. But not enough to come back differently, she said. He didn't answer. Leave, Alaric said. Cedric turned to him. Not the petition. Alaric's voice was the temperature of the room before a fire is lit. File it. Take it to the Court of Equity, and I will respond with every document I have. The original contract, the correspondence, the letter in which you ask a 16-year-old girl about her inheritance, and a complete financial history of what you've done with the quarterly allowance I've been paying you since the night you signed her away. He paused. I will also respond with a separate filing to the Crown's investigative office regarding the gambling operations you ran in Southwark in the years before the Hartwell gathering. I have names and dates and affidavits from 2 men who were involved in that operation and who are still, as far as I'm aware, willing to speak about it in exchange for the appropriate considerations. Prentice had gone very still. I have been building that file, Alaric said, for 3 years. Because I knew this conversation was coming. I didn't know when, but I knew it was coming. He looked at Cedric. The petition will cost you everything that remains of your name. The separate filing will cost you considerably more than that. The 2 men near the door exchanged a look. Prentice said carefully, Your Grace, the petition is already a matter of withdraw it, Alaric said, today, before 5 o'clock. The quarterly allowance ends on withdrawal. I'll pay a single settlement of £5,000 in exchange for a legal document in which you permanently renounce any claim to Miss Ashbourne's person, finances, or social representation and agree to remove yourself from England within 30 days. He paused. Those are the terms. They are not negotiable and they will not be repeated. Cedric stared at him. 5,000, Cedric said. You asked for 20. I'm offering 5 and the continued use of your name and your liberty. Alaric held his gaze. The alternative accounting involves neither. The room held its breath. Cedric looked at his daughter one more time. She looked back at him with those steady, exhausted eyes, and whatever he found in them, whatever fragment of the real thing he had been hoping was still accessible, it was not what he needed it to be, because his face closed, and he straightened, and he looked at Prentice. We'll need to review the counterterms, Prentice said, with the careful voice of a man recalculating. You have until 5 o'clock, Alaric said. The door is behind you. They left. Tut-tut. The library was quiet. Alaric stood at the window and watched the carriage pull away down the drive with the specific quality of attention he gave to threats that were retreating rather than resolved, still tracking, still reading, not yet certain of the trajectory. Cedric would take the terms. The 5,000 was enough, and the alternative was genuinely catastrophic. And Prentice would tell him so in the carriage with the flat honesty of a man who had just seen the size of what was being held against them. He would take the terms. But the library was still carrying the weight of what had been in it. Behind him, Evelyn had not moved from the chair. He was aware of her the way he was always aware of her in a room. Not as surveillance, not anymore, but as a kind of atmospheric fact, the way you're aware of weather through a window. He heard her draw a breath. Let it out. He thought about me, she said. He said so. Yes. That's not nothing. He turned around. She was looking at her hands, not at him. The posture of someone processing rather than performing, working through something at the level where the real processing happened. No, he said, it's not nothing. It's also not enough. She said it without bitterness. A flat, factual accounting, the voice of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through the full examination of the evidence rather than by deciding in advance what the conclusion should be. I wanted it to be enough. I wanted him to be... She stopped. I wanted there to be a version of him that was the version in the letters, the one who missed me and thought about me, and was just a man who had made bad decisions and needed time. That version may exist, Alaric said. And the version that filed a court petition to access your fortune may also exist. They're not incompatible. She looked up at him. Is that supposed to be comforting? No, it's supposed to be accurate. A pause. Then something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. The shape of how her face reorganized when she found something precisely right in the wrong circumstances. 3 years, she said. You've been building that file for 3 years. Yes. Since I was 13. Since you were 13 and Graves told me you were doing mathematics about the guardianship arrangement and what would happen at 18. He held her gaze. I knew what he would do when the number got close. I needed to be ready. She was quiet for a moment. You never told me. No. Why? He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had been not quite allowing himself to look for a long time, without the management, without the careful distance. Just the fact of her sitting in a chair in his library at 16 with the afternoon light on her face, and 7 years of shared silence and chess games and books, and the particular life they had built in this house sitting between them like a thing that needed naming. Because I was handling it, he said, and because I didn't want you to spend 3 years knowing it was coming. That's, she started, stopped. That's the most, another stop. Arrogant, he offered. I was going to say protective. Her voice was careful. But also arrogant, yes. Both are accurate. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon was running toward evening now, the light shifting its angle through the library windows, and in the changed quality of it, the room felt different from every other version of itself it had been, across all the years she had occupied it. Smaller, somehow, or maybe more exactly sized. Alaric, she said. The way she said it, not testing the word, the way she had tested it at 9 years old at the fire in the Hartwell sitting room, but owning it, the complete ease of a name used so many times it had lost its formality and become simply the sound a person made when they meant him specifically, hit somewhere that bypassed his architecture entirely. You were going to say something, she said, before they came in. I asked you something and you were going to answer it. The clock ran. He had been managing this particular moment for a year with the same precision he had managed everything else, and he was standing in his own library at the end of an afternoon that had stripped every other structure down to its foundation, and she was 16 years old, and the answer to her question was something that a man of his construction did not say to a girl of her age, regardless of what the clock in his chest was doing, and he knew that, and she knew that, and the fact that they both knew it was itself a kind of answer. Not tonight, he said. She held his gaze. But not never. He said it plainly, the way he said things he meant exactly and not more or less. When you're older, when the Cedric question is resolved and you've had time to— I don't need time, she said. I know. He held her gaze. I'm the one who needs time, to do this correctly. Something settled in her expression. Not disappointment, something more complex than that. The recognition of a man being honest about his own limits, rather than using limits as evasion, which she was old enough and sharp enough to know were not the same thing. How much time? She said. 2 years, he said. When you're 18, when it's legal, she said. Clear, he said. When it's clear. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her book, opened it to the page she had not been reading, and said, All right. He looked at her. 2 years, she said, without looking up. I've waited longer for things that mattered less. The withdrawal of the petition arrived at 4:30. Prentice's notation was terse and professional, the document itself flawlessly executed. The man knew his craft even in retreat. The counterterms were accepted in full. The 5,000, the renunciation document, the 30-day departure. Cedric's signature was at the bottom in the handwriting Alaric would have recognized across a room. He signed the settlement instrument and gave it to his own solicitor to process. Then he sat in the study until the light failed completely, not working, not moving, just sitting in the dark with the specific quality of a man who has won something and is still calculating the full cost of having won it. The petition was withdrawn. Cedric was handled. The file that had taken 3 years to build had done its work in under an hour, which was the nature of preparation. It created moments that looked like improvisation and felt, to the person on the other end, like the ground opening without warning. He was good at this. He had been good at this for so long that it had begun to feel like a fixed property of himself. The man who built the file, who anticipated the trap, who had the terms ready before the conversation required them. It was how he had made everything he had, and it was how he had kept Evelyn safe. And it was also, sitting in the darkened study, a thing he could see the edges of for the first time. The shape of what it cost to be that man, what you had to seal off to maintain that quality of readiness. He thought about her voice when she had said, "Not never." He thought about 2 years. He thought about what 2 years looked like from 16 and what it looked like from 32, and how those were not the same landscape at all, and about the particular responsibility of a man who had said a true thing to a young woman and now had to be the man who made that true thing into something real, rather than something that existed only in the precision of a carefully worded sentence. The fire had burned low. He got up and went to the door and was halfway down the corridor toward the East Library when his head of household appeared at the far end of the passage with an expression that Alaric recognized, the face of someone carrying news that they had been trying to decide how to deliver. "What?" he said. "A rider came, Your Grace, 20 minutes ago from Lord Harmon Whitmore." The man held out a sealed note. "He said to put it in your hand directly." Alaric took it, broke the seal, read it. His hand stopped moving. He read it again. The note was 8 lines. Whitmore's handwriting, fast and pressed hard, the writing of a man who had written quickly because the speed was itself part of the message. It concerned the Railway Consortium. It concerned a document that had surfaced that afternoon in the office of the Crown's financial regulatory body. A document filed anonymously, bearing the signatures of 2 members of the Ravenshade Holdings Board, alleging systematic falsification of the Eastern Corridor accounts over a period of 3 years. The signatures belonged to men Alaric had trusted for a decade. The accounts described in the allegation were not falsified, but the document was internally consistent, legally formatted, and had been filed with the regulatory body 3 hours ago, which meant it was already a matter of official record, which meant the morning papers would have it, which meant by sunrise every financial relationship Alaric had built across 15 years of careful work would be sitting under a cloud that would take months to clear, even after the falsification was proven false. Which was the point. Cedric had not come today with one trap. He had come with 2. The petition, the thing in the library, the solicitor and the court document, and the £20,000, that had been the foreground. The thing you were supposed to fight. The thing designed to occupy every ounce of Alaric's attention and precision and preparation, while the real mechanism was being filed 3 miles away in the offices of the Crown's financial body by men Alaric had considered beyond question. He stood in the corridor with the note in his hand and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation of a man who has been outmaneuvered, not defeated. He had resources, legal standing, documentation that would ultimately dismantle this entirely. But not tonight. Tonight the document was filed. Tonight the damage was already in motion, moving through the city's financial networks with the speed that damaging information always moved. Faster than truth, faster than correction. By morning, the Eastern Corridor Consortium would be an emergency session. By morning, his board members, both of them, the 2 signatures on the document, would be unreachable or already making statements he had not approved. By morning, the foundation of everything he had built would be demonstrably intact but publicly questioned, which in financial markets was functionally the same as demonstrably cracked. Cedric Ashbourne had spent 7 years on a quarterly allowance, and he had spent at least some of that time learning from the man who had outmaneuvered him. Alaric folded the note, put it in his coat, looked down the corridor toward the East Library, where a lamp still burned, where Eveline was reading a book she was actually reading this time, 2 years away from 18, unaware that the ground under both of them had just shifted in a way that the morning was going to make visible to everyone. He thought about what it meant to have nothing left to lose. He had always known the theory of it, had watched other men reach that point, and had noted, with the analytical distance of a man who had never quite been there, the way it changed their decision-making, the recklessness that looked like courage, the clarity that came when all the careful structures were stripped away and you were left with the single irreducible fact of what you would not surrender. He understood it now. Not his theory. He walked toward the library door. Tomorrow, everything that could be burned was going to burn, and he was going to build it back. But first he was going to walk through that door. He walked through the door. Eveline looked up from the book. She read his face in the span of a breath. She had been reading his face for 7 years and she was very good at it. And she set the book down without marking her page, which told him she already understood that the page didn't matter right now. "What happened?" she said. He crossed to the desk and set Whitmore's note in front of her. She read it. Once, quickly. Then again, slower, her eyes moving through the lines with the precise attention of someone extracting every implication rather than just the surface content. When she finished, she set it flat on the desk with the same deliberate care she had given the book, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He planned both of them at the same time." "Yes." "The petition was the distraction." "Yes." She looked at the note. "The two board members. How long have they been working with him?" "I don't know yet. Long enough to file something internally consistent." He sat down across from her, not at the desk, in the chair beside it, the chair where she had sat at 9 years old with an oversized coat across the armrest and her feet not reaching the floor. "Long enough to know which accounts would look most damaging." "Can you prove it's false?" "Yes, not tonight." She absorbed this. How bad is tonight? Bad enough that the morning will be difficult. The consortium will panic. Some of them will move to distance themselves before verification, which is the nature of financial reputation. Proximity to allegation is itself a liability, regardless of outcome. He looked at her steadily. "The accounts are clean. I can prove that. But proving it will take weeks, and the damage to certain relationships will take longer than that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knew you had the file on the gambling operations. He knew you'd use it if he pushed the petition. So he needed something that would cost you more than the petition cost him." "Yes." "He traded the petition for your financial reputation." She looked at him. "He took the 5,000 and the withdrawal, and he still left the second trap running because the second trap was always the real one." Her voice was even. The voice she used when she was thinking rather than feeling, the clean analytical register that Graves had spent years developing and that she had made entirely her own. "He's more dangerous than you thought." "He's more patient than I thought," Alaric said, "which is a different thing." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" He had been asking himself that question since the corridor. The answer had been assembling itself during the walk from his study to this room, the way answers assembled when the thinking had already been done and was simply waiting for the moment of articulation. "Tonight I contact Whitmore and 2 other consortium members I trust completely. We build a coordinated response before the morning papers. I brief my solicitors on the full scope of what Cedric has done. The petition, the board members, the correspondence with you, and I file a comprehensive countercomplaint with the regulatory body before they open tomorrow." He paused. "And then I deal with the board members." "Deal with them how?" "Terminate their positions, immediately and publicly with cause, which preempts any narrative in which they're victims of my retaliation rather than architects of a false filing." She was quiet. They had families here. Positions. They made a choice. "I know." She said it without argument, not endorsing the coldness but not flinching from it either, the particular quality of someone who had spent years watching how a man like Alaric operated and had arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of what that operation required. "I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying you'll carry it." He looked at her. "You carry all of them," she said. "Every decision that costs someone something. You don't show it, but you carry it." She held his gaze. "I've watched you do it for 7 years." The fire had burned low. Neither of them moved to add to it. The room was warm enough still, the specific warmth of a space that has held 2 people for hours, that has absorbed the heat of inhabitation and holds it past the immediate source. "I need to make the calls," he said. "I know." She stood. "I'll have Mrs. Calloway bring coffee to the study. You'll be there until morning." She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. He was still in the chair. He looked at her across the library, the room where she had returned books and read in parallel silence and lost chess games deliberately misplayed, and asked him once, at 9 years old, whether he was unkind, with the gravity of a child asking the most important question available to her. The room where, this afternoon, she had looked at her father and asked him if he had missed her with the same gravity, older now and heavier and no less clear. "I'm sorry," he said, "that he used your letters." She was still for a moment. Don't be. He didn't get what he came for. He got something. He got £5,000 and a withdrawal and 30 days to leave England. The suggestion of that almost smile moved through her expression. You had him completely in under an hour, Alaric. The second filing is a problem you'll solve in 2 weeks. She paused. Don't apologize for the thing that didn't break. He looked at her. Go make your calls, she said, and left. He worked until 4 in the morning. Whitmore was awake when he called, which was either insomnia or the specific anxiety of a man who had sent a warning note and spent the intervening hours wondering what it had set in motion. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Alaric had always valued in him, despite the man's general lack of subtlety. He knew when to be quiet. When Alaric finished, Whitmore said, The 2 signatures. Do you want their names public before the regulatory body opens? Yes, with documentation. I can have 3 other consortium members coordinated by 7 this morning. Do it. The calls to his solicitors took 2 hours. The counter-complaint was drafted by midnight and ready to file at first light. The termination letters for both board members were written and witnessed and delivered by private courier to their London addresses before 2 in the morning. Not cruel, not embellished, just the flat contractual language of men whose positions had ended on account of a specific documented act. He had written dozens of termination letters. These 2 cost him something the others hadn't, because he had trusted these men. And trust was the thing he had always been most careful with and most damaged by its loss. That was what Cedric had understood, eventually. Not the financial leverage. Anyone with access to the accounts could have seen the leverage. The thing Cedric had grasped, somewhere in 7 years of exile and slow planning, was that the real way to damage Alaric Ravenshade was not to attack his money, but to attack his trust. To reach inside the structure he had built, and turn the parts of it he believed in against him. To make him doubt the foundations. Sitting at his desk at 3 in the morning with the counter-complaint finalized and the termination letters delivered, Alaric thought about that. About what it cost to build something. Not money, but the specific human investment of deciding to believe in people, of extending the kind of operational trust that made institutions function and relationships real. About how that investment made you vulnerable in exact proportion to its depth. About whether the answer to that vulnerability was to stop investing, to build everything at arm's length, to run every structure as a transaction rather than a commitment. He had tried that before Evelyn. He had been very good at it. It had produced an empire and a house that functioned like clockwork, and a quality of silence that was entirely different from the silence he had learned to inhabit since a child with dark hair and careful eyes came to occupy the East Library. He thought about what she had said. You carry all of them. He did. He always had. The decisions that cost other people something, the choices made from necessity rather than preference, the accumulated weight of being the man who decided things. He carried that weight in the specific way that men who don't speak about their inner lives carry things, which was quietly and continuously, and without putting it down long enough to fully feel its mass. He had never had anyone notice that he was carrying it. She had noticed at 16. He sat with that for a while. Let it be what it was, rather than processing it into something manageable. Outside, the pre-dawn was starting its slow approach, the darkness outside the study window shifting from absolute to merely deep, the quality of light beginning to differentiate itself from the quality of night. He would be 33 in 4 months. She would be 18 in 2 years. Those were facts that existed in a specific relationship to each other, and he had stated that relationship plainly in the library, and she had accepted it plainly, and there was something in that plainness, in the complete absence of performance from both of them, in the way the thing between them had been named in the stripped-down aftermath of a difficult afternoon without ceremony or strategy, that felt more real than anything he had built with deliberate care. He did not know, entirely, what to do with something real. He had been building things on purpose for so long that the accidental ones arrived without instructions. He would figure it out. He was, when necessary, a patient man. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of November morning that made the Ravenshade grounds look architectural, the bare trees against a pale sky like something drawn rather than grown. Alaric had slept 2 hours on the study sofa and woken at 6 with the specific alertness of a man whose body had been informed by long practice that 2 hours was the available allocation and had organized itself accordingly. The counter-complaint was filed at 8. By 9, Whitmore's coordinated statement from 4 consortium members was in the hands of the 2 papers that mattered. By 10, the regulatory body had received the documentation establishing that the original filing had been made using forged internal records, traceable through a chain of document access to a specific meeting between the 2 terminated board members and a solicitor named Prentice operating on behalf of a Lord Cedric Ashbourne, currently in the process of legal departure from England under the terms of a signed renunciation instrument. By noon, the story in the financial press was no longer about the allegation. It was about the allegation's collapse. Alaric read the afternoon edition in his study with the particular quality of satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the specific relief of watching a thing you built prove that it was built correctly. The Eastern Corridor accounts were clean. The consortium was intact. 2 men had made a choice and were living with its consequences. Cedric Ashbourne was, according to the solicitors, in the process of arranging passage. He folded the paper, set it down, went to find Evelyn. She was in the garden, which surprised him. She rarely used the garden in November, preferring the library's warmth to the estate's cold, formal grounds. But she was there, in a dark coat, standing at the far end of the south terrace, where the stone balustrade looked out over the lower grounds toward the tree line, and she was not doing anything. Not reading, not walking, just standing with her hands on the stone rail and her face turned toward the distance. He came to stand beside her. She didn't look at him. Is it resolved? The material part. The rest is maintenance. The board members? Gone. She was quiet for a moment. The cold moved between them, the specific intimacy of shared weather. How do you feel? It was not a question he was asked, by anyone. It was not, in his social and professional world, a question that was considered, which was one of the ways that world had always suited him, and one of the ways he had understood, increasingly, that the suit was imperfect. He thought about it honestly. Older than yesterday, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the tree line. He's actually leaving, she said. My father. Yes. I thought I'd feel more when it was final. She looked back at the grounds. I thought there'd be something, grief or an anger or, I don't know, relief that had some weight to it. She was quiet. Mostly, I just feel like something that was unfinished for a long time got finished. Not the way you want unfinished things to finish, just done. That's enough, he said. Done is enough. She looked at him. Is that what you believe? About things that cost you? That done is enough? He considered it. Really considered it, not the quick, efficient processing, but the slower thing, the kind of thought that required staying in an uncomfortable place long enough to find out what was actually there. I believe, he said, that the cost of a thing and the value of a thing are not in opposition, that what you pay for something is part of what makes it real. He paused. I paid for this house, for the manor and everything in it and everything it runs. I paid in years and decisions and the particular price of being the man who makes choices other people don't want to make. He looked at the garden, the cold stone, the bare November landscape. I'd pay it again. She was quiet. Not because I had to, he said. Because I chose to. There's a difference. He felt her looking at him. He turned to meet it. Her face in the November light was older than yesterday, too. Not in the physical way, but in the interior way. The kind of aging that happened when a significant thing passed through a person and reorganized what was on the other side. She had been through her father, through the petition, through the letters and the library and the long dark arithmetic of 2 years, and she was standing on the other side of all of it, with her hands on the cold stone and her eyes clear, and the full weight of who she was, who she had grown into in this house, in the East Library, and the South Sitting Room, and the chess games played honestly once he stopped losing on purpose. Entirely visible. I've been thinking, she said, about what you said last night, about 2 years. Evelyn, I'm not pushing the timeline, she said. I understand the timeline. I'm saying I've been thinking about why it matters to you. She paused. Not legally. I understand the legal dimension. I'm asking about the other reason, the one you didn't say. He looked at her. You want me to be certain, she said. You want me to have time and distance and enough of the world outside this house that when I decide anything, I'm deciding it from a full understanding of what I'm deciding, not from gratitude, not from proximity. She held his gaze. That's it, isn't it? He was quiet for a moment. Yes. That's... She exhaled, a breath that carried something that was not quite a laugh and not quite frustration. The sound of a person confronting the full complexity of being genuinely cared for by someone who is also genuinely difficult. That is the most careful thing anyone has ever said to me. I need it to be right, he said. Not just true. Right. She turned to look at the grounds again. The light was changing, the pale morning moving toward the flat gray of a November afternoon, the tree line holding its bare architectural stillness against the sky. 2 years, she said. Not a resignation. An agreement. The voice of someone who had assessed the terms and found them, if not what she wanted, then what she respected. 2 years, he said. They stood at the stone railing together in the cold and the quiet, and the distance between them was exactly what it had always been, and also, in some way that neither of them named aloud, already entirely different. Botu. 2 years moved, the way years moved when the life inside them was substantial, not quickly, not slowly, but with the full weight of days that accumulated into something real. Evelyn turned 18 in the October of her second year at a small dinner that Alaric arranged with the people who had actually mattered across the years of her growing up. Graves, dry and unsentimental and present, who gave her a first edition of a Latin text she had been hunting for since she was 14. Mrs. Calloway, who had replaced Mrs. Hargreave after that November, and who had proven to be a woman of considerable discretion and genuine warmth. Whitmore, who had adopted a gruff avuncular manner toward Evelyn that he would have denied under oath. After the dinner, after the guests had gone, Alaric found her in the East Library. She was standing at the shelves, not reading, not looking for anything specific, just standing with her hand on the spine of a book, the way you stand with your hand on something familiar, the touch of a person in a room they know completely. He came to stand beside her. 18, she said. Yes. She turned to look at him. The fire behind them cast its particular moving light, the same light that had been in this room for all the years of her inhabiting it, and her face in it was the face he had been watching change and settle and become what it was. Not the watchful, careful face of a child managing her exposure, but a face that had grown into its own authority, the authority of a person who had built her character from the inside out, rather than performing it from the outside in. I went to London last month, she said, with Graves to the university library. I spent 3 days there, and I met people my age, and I saw what was available, what the world outside this house looked like. She held his gaze. I came back. I know, he said. I know you did. Not because I had nowhere else to go. She said it plainly, the tone of a woman who had graduated from careful to direct and found that direct served her better. Because I wanted to. He looked at her. I've seen the world outside, she said. Enough of it. Enough to know what I'm deciding and what I'm deciding from. She paused. Are you going to tell me I need more time? No, he said. Good. She turned back to the shelf. Her hand was still on the spine of the book. Because I've been waiting 2 years to have a conversation, and I would like to have it before I lose my nerve. You don't have nerve to lose. I lose it around you specifically. She said it without looking at him, the specific honesty of someone making an admission sideways, because making it directly was the one thing that still required gathering. I've been composed in front of difficult people my entire life. You're the only one who makes me have to work at it. He was quiet. She turned to face him fully. The East Library was warm and still and held all the years of the life they had built in it, the chess games and the parallel silences and the books in wrong places on the shelves, and the afternoon where a child had asked him if he was unkind, and he had said not to you and meant it in ways he hadn't yet had the language for. I love you, she said. I have for a long time. I'm not asking you what you feel because I already know what you feel. I'm saying it because I decided 2 years ago that when I turned 18, I was going to say it plainly and not dress it up or qualify it, and I'm standing here doing that. She held his gaze. Now you. He looked at her for a moment, a long moment, the kind that held everything in it, The full 7 years of distance and chess and the deliberate managed precision of a man maintaining the architecture of a right thing for a long time. And then he said, I love you. I have since before I understood what it was. I managed it poorly and correctly at the same time, which is the only way I knew how to manage it, and I don't apologize for the timeline, because the timeline was right even when it was hard. He paused. But I'm done being careful. She exhaled, a breath that carried years in it. Finally, she said. They married in the spring, quietly, with the same handful of people who had been present at the October dinner and no one else, because neither of them had any interest in performing their life for the assembled aristocracy of England. The announcement in the papers was brief and factual. Society, predictably, had opinions. They did not find those opinions particularly compelling. Alaric discovered in the months after the wedding that there was a version of his life he had not known was available, so not a different life, not a departure from the man he had been, but a version of the same man that had been sealed off by years of necessary containment, and that now, given a single persistent point of genuine warmth, opened in ways that were structural rather than performative. He laughed more, not at different things, at the same dry observations and precise absurdities he had always registered as funny and rarely expressed, but with less management of the expression. Evelyn noticed immediately. You laughed, she said, the first time he did it at the dinner table, genuinely, at something Graves had said about a particularly incoherent legal brief. I do that, he said, not in front of people. You're not people. She had looked at him with the expression that was the direct descendant of the not-quite smile he had watched develop since she was 9, and said, That is either the least romantic, or the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, and I can't decide which. Both, he said. Both, she agreed. Graves retired that autumn, at his own insistence, and with a pension that made him briefly argue before conceding. He left the East Library in better order than he'd found it, and less order than Alaric had maintained it, which was exactly the state it had been in since Evelyn had started reading in it, and which was, Alaric had decided, the correct state. Cedric Ashbourne left England on a gray December morning, 3 weeks after signing the renunciation document, on a ship headed for the continent. Evelyn knew the date. She stood at the window of the East Library that morning and looked at the grounds and said nothing, and Alaric sat at the desk with his correspondence and did not press her, because pressing her had never been the right approach, and he had learned that at roughly the same time he had learned everything else important about her, which was years ago, in increments, the way you learn things that actually matter. After a while she said, He was a bad father. Yes, Alaric said, and a reasonably intelligent man, which made him more dangerous than just a bad one. Yes. She turned from the window. I don't hate him. I know. I don't forgive him either, not the way people mean it when they say it, like it's a door that closes. She looked at him. I've decided to stop carrying it, what he did and what he didn't do. I'm putting it down. He looked at her. That's harder than either of the other options. Yes, she said. That's why I'm saying it out loud. It's harder to put down things you've said aloud. He set down his correspondence. She crossed the library and sat down in the chair across from him. The chair she had always sat in, the chair she had been sitting in since she was 8 years old with an oversized coat and her feet not reaching the floor. And she looked at him with the clear eyes of a woman who had been through the full inventory of the things that could be taken from a person and had arrived on the other side of that inventory with her essential self intact. What are you thinking? She said. He looked at her. At the room around them, at the fire and the shelves and the window where the November grounds held their bare, intelligent stillness. At the life that had assembled itself from the wreckage of a gambling debt and a desperate man's worst decision and a night in a house in Hertfordshire, when a child had sat alone on a staircase and a man had crossed a room without entirely understanding why. He had built things his whole life, had built them well, had built them to last, had priced the cost of every beam and foundation stone, and had paid that cost without flinching because he understood that lasting things required the full payment. He had not understood until now what the most lasting things actually cost. Not money, not decisions, not even time, though all of those had been part of it. The most lasting things cost the willingness to be changed, to let what mattered actually reach you, past the architecture, past the management, past the years of careful distance. To arrive at the place where you could not protect yourself from the full weight of something real, and to discover that you didn't need to. That the weight was not a burden, it was just the feeling of something built to hold. "I'm thinking," he said, "that you should put your feet up. You've been standing all morning." She looked at him. Then she put her feet up on the edge of his desk, crossed at the ankle the way she had been doing at the desk in the East Library since she was 15, and Graves had stopped correcting it, and she picked up her book and opened it, and began to read. He picked up his correspondence. Outside, November moved through the raven shade grounds with its cold, clear purpose, and the fire burned steady and low, and the East Library held its warmth the way it had always held it, from the inside out, from the accumulated heat of years of occupation, from the specific and irreplaceable warmth of two people who had found, in the long, unlikely passage from a ballroom staircase to this room, the thing that neither of them had known they were looking for. Not salvation, in the end. Not rescue. Just this. A fire. A room. The quiet of two people who had nothing left to manage, and all the time in the world to simply be. Accept. The kingdom told many versions of their story over the years that followed. Some said the feared Duke of Ravenshade had purchased a child and remade her in his image, which was the version preferred by people who had never understood him. Some said the girl who had been traded away in a gambling deal had outmaneuvered them all, which was the version preferred by people who had never understood her. The truth was less dramatic and more durable than either story. Two people who had been abandoned by the same machinery of wealth and expectation had found, in the space between guardian and ward, teacher and student, the one specific kind of company that made the carrying bearable. That is not a story about ownership. It never was. It was a story about what survives the cost of being human, and what you find on the far side of every debt paid and every wall dismantled when you finally allow yourself to stop being afraid of the only thing that was ever worth building.